Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ingrid Gerstmann, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at the School of International and Public Affairs. On behalf of the Institute and our program Emerging Voices in National Security and Intelligence, and our co-sponsor Spectrum, LGBTQ and allies at SIPA, I want to welcome our students, friends, and colleagues, both here in person and on Zoom. A recording will be made of this panel, and we invite you to share it widely when it is up on the SIPA YouTube channel. Last fall, Cam and I were walking on campus, and Cam mentioned an idea for a panel like this, and I said, it's a terrific idea, and I don't think it's something that the Institute has ever hosted. So thank you to Cam for putting this together and bringing everyone here to Columbia. I think we have a terrific panel of experts here today, scholars and practitioners who are at the cutting edge in their respective lines of work, and I'm really excited to hear from all of them on our topic, protecting the rights of LGBTQ plus persons in areas of conflict. So we'll be joined by Graham Reed and Gretchen Baldwin in person, along with Cam, and on Zoom, we have Artemis Akbari and Ahmed Al-Hadi. So Cam, I'd like to say a few words about you. Cam Silver is a term professor at Barnard College, and he'll be leaving us next fall for a new position right at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So we're sorry to lose you, but you'll just be down the street. He is a foreign policy and cultural studies scholar. His research is at the intersection of American politics and international relations. He examines the domestic reality of foreign policy, queer politics, racial politics, social movements, pop culture, and genocide. It's quite a roster of interests. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm so honored to have our esteemed panelists, whether they be in person or online. You know, we're going to be looking at the critical issue of safeguarding the rights of LGBT plus and the individuals in conflict zones. We're here to look at this as a significant human rights challenge. That's just not only in ensuring the safety, but the dignity of LGBT plus people in the midst of armed conflict. So we're here because there's a stark disproportionate amount of violence and also hard shifts that LGBT plus people experience not only in conflict situations, but in times of peace. Back in 2015, CNN reported a story where they showed footage of ISIS executing gay men from buildings. This wasn't the Stone Age. This was just a few years ago. So the United Nations and other organizations have acknowledged their vulnerability, but there seems to be a disconnect between global discourse and the lived experiences of the LGBT. So it's important that we know that LGBT violence also extends beyond just conflict zones. If we look at here in the United States, we've seen tragedy such as the Paul's nightclub shooting, the Colorado club shootings, and in some states there are efforts to put the LGBT as second class citizens, thus underlining this new stark reality. Our distinguished panel of our experts will help us not only examine these challenges, but we will look at some of the limitations and we'll investigate how can we better uphold their dignity. So with that being said, we'll just dive right into it. I have a PowerPoint the questions. I'm not sure if someone can click on the PowerPoint for me. And how I arrange this is we'll do a few open-ended questions, then if any audience or virtual audience questions. Okay, so let's just dive into the first question. So there are already existing framework. So in what ways do existing international norms and frameworks such as the responsibility to protect and humanitarian law address the unique challenges faced by LGBT in conflict zones, and where do they fall short in providing adequate protection? So I'll leave this to our panel. Who would like to chime in on it first?
Sure, I can start. Should I introduce myself quickly?
Yeah.
So my name is Gretchen Baldwin. I'm a researcher on the Peace Operations and the Conflict Management team at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. I primarily work on gender and peace operations. You can imagine that does involve a fair amount of overlap into looking at queer folk situations in conflict zones. It's also a personal interest of mine, so I've been doing a bit of sort of exploratory work on this recently. And then prior to SIPRI, I did also work on gender and peace operations for 3.5 years at the International Peace Institute here in New York. And I'm a 2018 SIPA grad. Yes, students. So, I mean, this is a super important question, and it's one that I struggle with a little bit, so I'm a little bit nervous to be starting, but existing frameworks like R2P, like international humanitarian law, in theory, do, you know, insofar as they provide a framework for prevention of atrocities committed against vulnerable groups, basically by merit of difference, right? That they should innately include LGBT plus people. What we actually see in practice is that that group is not always sort of innately understood to be included. And I personally have fairly mixed feelings. I'm very curious to hear from other panelists and you know, very open to push back on this. But you know, I've heard some pushes to more explicitly include sexual and gender minorities as a group, you know, in frameworks like R2P, where already, for example, we see, you know, ethnicity, race, religion, gender as potential markers of difference that may then invite violence and atrocity. The problem with these sorts of lists is that you can just keep adding things, right? Like there are all sorts of vulnerabilities that could be continuously added to these lists. And sometimes I worry that the longer that they get, the easier it is then to forget certain other categories, right? Like if we add LGBT plus people, but not, you know, disabled people, like then what happens, right? Like where does it stop? And so the beauty of these frameworks is that they do provide sort of a broad, just like a broad entry point to say, okay, anyone experiencing sort of vulnerabilities, you know, is deserving of protection. This is why, and I'll be brief here so others can speak, but I do just want to point out where they fall short is often international organizations or institutions, particularly those in the West, those based in the West, right? So like the UN, fine, it's international, but it's here. And I work primarily on the UN. You know, the EU is the same. NATO is similar, I should say. The EU, NATO, they're similar. These multilateral organizations, the AU, you know, is a little bit newer. And I'm actually not, I'm not really sure what the AU is particularly doing in LGBT plus, right? So I won't comment on it. But a lot of these institutions are based in the West. They have a very Western-centric perspective. And so in my own work, what I hear a lot of times is that I literally hear people say that there are not queer people in conflict-affected areas, right? Like I'm like, I just had somebody tell me this recently about South Sudan. Like, this isn't a protection concern because we don't know of any community-based organizations that are doing protection work for this community, and therefore we don't think that this community exists. And it's really, really distressing. And so I think that is, unfortunately, it kind of needs to be the starting point, like the blind spot just within organizations that are doing conflict response work, that are doing prevention work, that are providing protection in theory. They have to at least recognize, like they have to know that this is a community that is going to exist anywhere that they're working. So I'll stop there. Happy to expand on any of this there, but yeah.
Can I comment?
I would like to go on next. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just will second the point that was said about, you hear, oh, there is no queer people there and others. And I think this is really where international organizations fall short. And this is where our role as people come, I'm Egyptian. I will introduce myself. My name is Ahmed El-Hadi. Okay, I will shock you with this. I'm a scientist. I'm a professor of neuroscience. I study collective decision making, but I'm also in parallel life. I do lobbying for LGBTQ rights, especially focusing on Egypt and human rights broadly. And I see this shortcoming happen, but this is our role of the diaspora that lives abroad. There are many LGBT people who fled the region and can be the point of contact for this international organization to explain kind of, okay, where do you find the underground organization? Usually these organizations are underground, and then you need just access from the local community. And that's very important. And we see this as a very important point to always raise. Because you will hear the usual reaction response from these governments, like let's say Egypt, they will say, oh, we don't have gay people and stuff, but of course exist anywhere. But the point of really finding your good local point of contact that you can coordinate with. In terms of vulnerable people in the international law, I actually support to have it explicitly written, because then you really begin to solve this other issue of falling short with cultural context. Because when you say vulnerable people, it's really can be culturally defined. And when you have it explicitly, universally stated, then you can push back against this relativization in terms of what it means in the local context. You will always have a backlash, of course, but it's really, you can depend on the diaspora living then abroad and really coordinate with them and organizations representing these countries abroad that have local connections. So that was my comment. Thank you for raising it.
Yes, please go. The floor is all yours.
Okay. First of all, hello everyone. It's an honor for me to be here, and thank you so much for your invitation. First I should introduce myself. I'm Artemis Akbari. I'm Afghan LGBT rights activist. I am director of Afghan LGBTI organization, and we do advocacy for the rights of LGBTI people in Afghanistan and also the rights of LGBTI asylum seekers at the EU level. About this question, in my perspective, international norms and frameworks do provide protection for LGBTI people indirectly, and I think these international norms and frameworks do not address some unique challenges by the LGBTI people in conflict zone, and it's not adequate and enough. For example, Geneva Convention or international humanitarian law or other international treaties prohibits the violence, or according to R2P principles, all the states should protect the population at risk, and also R2P principles recognize the responsibility of the international community to protect the population at risk. And I think these international norms applies to all individuals, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But I think they didn't explicitly mentioned the situation of LGBTI people in conflict zone or in regions like Afghanistan or Syria. I think these norms and frameworks are applicable just on paper, not in practice. For example, in Afghanistan, I can give you an example about Afghanistan. LGBTI people in Afghanistan, they face discrimination, violence, torture, and they face multiple violence after the fall of Afghanistan. And unfortunately, Taliban, they do not recognize these international norms or frameworks. And we've seen many reports of human rights abuses by the Taliban. And LGBTI people in conflict zone, for example, in Afghanistan, they face some unique challenges inside the country that these international norms and frameworks cannot address those challenges. And though these international norms and frameworks are not enough to address these unique challenges. For example, LGBTI people in Afghanistan, they face multiple discrimination and multiple violence. For example, they face violence and discrimination from the state, and also from the non-state actors and armed groups. For example, when Afghanistan, when the first government of Taliban fell down in 2001 by the United States and other Western countries, a democratic government established with the help of Western countries in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, we've seen that many LGBTI people were harassed, were suppressed, oppressed by that democratic government that were supported by the Western countries. On the other hand, some of the LGBTI people in some of the region of Afghanistan were targeted and attacked by the armed groups or non-state actors. And I think LGBTI people in conflict zone, they face additional barriers in accessing humanitarian assistance. For example, our organizations or our radio received many reports from the LGBTI people on the ground inside of Afghanistan that they try to have access to some humanitarian assistance. They asked for help from some of the international humanitarian organizations to give them some humanitarian assistance. But unfortunately, they were discriminated by the local staff of those humanitarian organizations. So this is the main problem, that many LGBTI people on the ground in conflict zone, they cannot have access to those humanitarian assistance because of their different gender expression or gender identity or sexual orientations. I don't want to mention the name of a specific organizations, but there were some big organization and important organization inside of Afghanistan that their local staffs discriminated LGBTI people. And I think international community, they don't have a strong will to address the challenges of LGBTI people, in conflict zone like Afghanistan. For example, in 2001, when the first government of Taliban fell down and an international community entered Afghanistan, NGOs entered the Afghanistan to make peace in Afghanistan, to build peace in Afghanistan. They made many efforts to include women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or other marginalized groups in peace building and peacemaking efforts. But unfortunately, they didn't include LGBTI people. Not only they didn't include LGBTI people in peace building and making efforts, but also they didn't address the challenges and violence that LGBTI people experienced during the conflict, during the war. And I think these international norms and frameworks are not applicable, and they're applied just on paper because international community doesn't have the strong willingness to address these challenges. Thank you so much.
Okay, last but not least.
Thanks so much. So my name is Graham Reed, and I'm the director of the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch. We document, as you will know, we document human rights abuses around the world, and we have a global focus with with researchers who focus specifically on Latin America, on the MENA region, on Sub-Saharan Africa and Europe, and also in the US. Being at the sort of fourth panelist to speak, I can sort of echo a lot of what has already been said. I think we're all in agreement that kind of generically and technically everyone is indeed protected, but in the sense that no one's expressly excluded, of course, but some groups are functionally excluded or underserved or not seen or recognized, their needs not adequately acknowledged or addressed. So for people, and here would include LGBT plus people who experience discrimination, marginalization, and in some instances criminalization, either of same-sex conduct or gender expression in peacetime, and this is to pick up on the point you made in your introductory remarks, is that there are then likely to be, their precarious situation in peacetime is likely to be exacerbated in a situation of conflict, meaning that vulnerable groups are especially vulnerable in conflict situations. And I would see specifically with LGBT people, the issue of invisibility and then social hostility, which sometimes also manifests itself, as I've mentioned, in criminalization. And a lot of our research has shown the ways in which criminal laws, even when they're not enforced or implemented, contribute to negative social attitudes, which creates an environment of marginalization for LGBT people. I think another dimension is also the economic marginalization that LGBT people often experience in peacetime, and the kind of informal economies that are severely disrupted in times of conflict, and that is an added form of vulnerability. So, I mean, I take Artemis's point is that, you know, to what extent do these international frameworks, to what extent are they effective in a situation like in Afghanistan, for example, where international norms are routinely flouted? I thought that, you know, just to pick up, Rachel, on 2 points that you made, the idea that they know queer people, or you flagged the example of the African Union, which I thought would be useful to elaborate on a little bit, just because I think it illustrates another point, and that's that the African Union, you know, rejected the African Commission for Human and People's Rights after much deliberation, finally accepted the observer status of an organization called the Coalition of African Lesbians. But the African Union rejected that on the grounds that the mandate of the African Commission was to promote African cultural values. And so by recognizing a lesbian organization, they were clearly contradicting their mandate. And I use this as an illustrative example of a more common phenomenon, which is to relegate LGBT people not in the terrain of human rights, but to religion, culture, and tradition, of which that's a very good example. And of course, the AU had another agenda to that, which was to undermine the independence of the African Commission by using this as a kind of wedge issue. Anyway, I won't go into, you know, it seems like a little bit too much of a side track. And then I won't kind of duplicate what Artemis has said, but you know, the Afghanistan example is very vivid in terms of the kinds of vulnerabilities experienced in peacetime. Human Rights Watch and Outright International documented abuses based on sexual orientation and gender identity prior to the Taliban takeover, but then that harsh situation, of course, became much, much worse, with little or no support for LGBT people, including from the point you've made from civil society organizations that one might expect to offer support to marginalized groups. I think I'll stop there.
Wow. So I think this kind of goes nicely into the second question that we were kind of talking about this. Graham, you alluded to this. So let's kind of dive in a little deeper. Who want to go first here? Because I think, you know, the issue is how can we protect the rights of the LGBT while we respecting cultural differences?
It is, I will begin. So I think it's one of the most difficult questions we all face because, you have seen, the campaigns that happened during the Qatar, for example, World Cup and the whole backlash that happened during this. And I think the most important thing is that international organizations need to find a way to really have a way to coordinate with the diaspora living abroad, which is very significant, people either on asylum or who are located abroad that have anyway connections to local NGOs. So I have, for example, I get information from local NGOs through encrypted ways, through other safe ways that I know the information that then we can disseminate abroad and then meet with international organizations in order to explain to them the situations, what can be said, what cannot be said. But at the end, this is also has this limitation. At the end, you will end up with some kind of a confrontation, but the idea is to reduce that type of reactionary behavior from the government. So, for example, I will take, I have worked on Egypt a lot, and still, usually, if, for example, when the rainbow events happened in 2017, and there are many people that were arrested, the international organization were very hesitant how to approach the Egyptian government about this, not to repeat things that happened many years ago in 2001 with the Queen boat, where then this led to some internal backlash. But so this shouldn't also prevent the international organization from interfering. So they say, okay, there is some cultural differences, we don't want to interfere. No, you need to say your say, but in coordination with local organizations. So if we have a statement, for example, it should be signed from, for example, Egyptian activists, other Syrian and others activists who are living abroad in conjunction with international organizations, so that it's not very easy to just discredit it. Oh, these are just Western organizations that are trying to impose their agenda on us. So I think that's the best way I have personally found that we can address this, and then also listen to the local community. What is the best way to advocate? And in most times, they would like international organizations to advocate for them, but it always has to be calibrated on how loud it is, what the tone is in addressing the governments. Especially to that Graham have pointed something very important, is that the LGBT issue is used as a scapegoat for many things. So let's say suddenly there is an economical crisis in Egypt, which there is the gay issue, the LGBT issue will surface and then begin a whole hinge to really focus the media and the moral panic on it. Another thing is the coordination also is to really, especially US-based organizations, have to begin to notice, and I have seen it in Egypt, that there is what I call this transnational evangelical collaboration. So gay conversion therapy is not outlawed in Egypt, and there are Christian evangelical groups that visit Egypt, and some who are invited to the US to teach them how to, advocate for gay conversion and stuff like this. And this, our US allies here can really try to highlight this type of transnational, I would say, transphobia and homophobia, where they try to teach religious or very conservative groups in Egypt how to change their discourse so that it is not labeled as Islamist or backward. So you can see a lot of adoption of the American highly conservative discourse. I have seen it in Egypt. I have seen it in other areas in the region. And here, I think organizations specifically based in the US have a responsibility to stop this flow of discourse. Thank you.
Who else would like to intervene on this? Yeah, please.
I mean, this is an issue that's so central to our work at Human Rights Watch, the sensitivities and difficulties that Arnold just pointed out. It's also something that is of interest to me in the course that I teach at SIPA, which is about how does one make universal claims based on identities that are historically contingent and culturally produced, and even just the language and terminology and acronyms that we use that have particular histories attached to them and that are not necessarily recognizable and inclusive of all forms of sexual and gender expression, right? So that's one of the kinds of complications. But to take the point is that where possible, and of course it's not always possible, but the kind of strong engagement with organizations that are working in a particular country who understand the politics of how to navigate on very difficult issues much better than international organizations. I think that, domestic organizations also play a very important role in research and advocacy around peace and security. An example being Colombia Diversa, who had a database of violent killings of LGBT people since 2004, and they conducted specific research that would have been very difficult for any other groups to do, especially in smaller cities and towns, interviewing activists and also working with women's rights groups in the development of a national plan on women, peace and security, which really gained global attention because of including LGBT actors in the peace-making discussions. And so that represented the first time that a gender-inclusive peace deal has mainstreamed LGBT participation. I think also for us, another important example in Lebanon, the group Mosaic that documented the effects of Syrian conflict on LGBT plus people. And, I think that the international organizations should ensure that there's an inclusive approach to gender-based violence that includes LGBT people. And I think, going back to the point that Ahmed was making, is that sometimes, and this is a little bit tangential to the specificity of the discussion, but it's also just a way of how to frame issues. So the Queen Boat incident that you referred to, when Human Rights Watch did a report on that, the focus was not on LGBT rights, but the focus was on torture. And so to kind of frame it in a broader way that's applicable to most people that could identify that torture is wrong in any circumstance, regardless of what they might think of the particularities of LGBT rights.
Okay, does everyone else want to chime in? Yes. Please, go on.
Okay. I think it is really important that international organizations or peacekeeping missions build a relationship of trust with the local actors, including civil societies, community leaders, or regional actors, because and to understand the cultural differences, cultural differences, and regional context of a country. For example, I heard a lot from the LGBT rights activists in Europe, European LGBT rights activists. They told me, why LGBTI people in Afghanistan are silent? Why don't they go on the street to do protests for their rights? And even they told me to encourage, they asked me to encourage the LGBTI people in Afghanistan to do demonstration and protest for their rights. I think it's a really, really dangerous and perspective. It's a really wrong perspective, because, and in my opinion, it stems from a lack of understanding the context of the Afghanistan, and it is really, and I think it's really important that international organizations and to conduct a cultural training for their staffs or partners, and teach them about the language that relates to LGBTI people. For example, maybe why language of LGBTI people? For example, last year, United Nations appointed Mr. Richard Bennett as a UN special rapporteur for the human rights situation in Afghanistan. And Mr. Richard Bennett published a report about the human rights situation in Afghanistan on February. And at the end of his report, just in one paragraph, he addressed the situation, addressed the human rights abuses of LGBTI people in Afghanistan, and he tried to address the situation of LGBTI people in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule. But unfortunately, the report was so short; it was just in one paragraph, and it wasn't deep enough. And on the other, and more importantly, the report, the Dari and Pashto version of the report contained homophobic and transphobic words and terms for LGBTI people. In his reports, he used many offensive words for the LGBTI people. I spoke with Mr. Bennett at the European Parliament, and he said that unfortunately the staffs and the interpreter weren't trained enough about the LGBTI people, and that's why the staffs and the interpreter used offensive and transphobic terms and words. And I think it's really important to conduct a training, cultural training about the LGBTI people for the staffs and partners. And another thing that I want to highlight is that international organizations and peacekeeping missions should empower the LGBT rights activists on the ground and work with the LGBTI people on the ground, because they know the unique challenges that LGBTI people face in Afghanistan or in other conflict zones area, and the LGBT rights activists, they can give you a special and unique insight about the reality of the situation of LGBTI people on the ground, and also they can help you in designing a program that's are culturally appropriate, I think.
Wow. Okay. I'm just thinking that there, what you said, there's no universal LGBT very brilliant, and I think sometimes that gets kind of belated. Before we move on, do you want to add anything?
Sure, I can just very quickly. I fully second, third, and fourth, everything that's already been said, and I won't sort of continue maybe on the contextual understanding line, but speaking specifically to peacekeeping missions, maybe, since that's part of the question, and that's primarily what I work on. I think this issue is a really good example of where peace operations in particular need to really know and acknowledge their limits. And this is not to say that, I worry sometimes when I say this that it can be seen as permission to not care or not give any attention to this at all or any acknowledgement, which is not at all what I'm saying. So that's on the record. But for example, when we think about military peacekeepers or police peacekeepers at UN missions who are largely tasked with physical protection, preventative protection tasks, they are in these countries for very, very short tours, sometimes as little as 6 months, sometimes 3. That is not the profile of someone who is well equipped to deal with very sensitive cultural protection issues. Civilian peacekeepers, different story. They're often in country a lot longer. They can take that long time to cultivate relationships with local organizations, to really think critically, to form those relationships, to take in advice and guidance from folks on the ground who actually are living this. But I do think, not everyone can do everything. And I do sometimes worry also that in these conversations, like I work a lot with the Department of Peace Operations at the UN in my capacity as an independent researcher. And there is currently a push to include reference, any reference at all. It's very unusual to have a reference to LGBT plus or, whatever acronym they're trying to use. That's also a huge debate within the UN. And I think that's a positive step. But again, I really worry that it's sort of going to make, addressing queer people's realities the responsibility of every individual peacekeeper. And that can be really dangerous, right? That risks outing people. It risks peacekeepers going in with their individual assumptions. It also risks, as, I think all my fellow panelists have touched on, it risks bringing in a pretty Western-centric perspective, even if the peacekeepers that we're talking about are not from Western countries. they're still coming in from the UN or from any given multilateral institution. These are based on very Western driven ideals. And so you risk having this sort of this idea that there is one queer experience, that there is one way of doing this properly, that every queer person, every culture has the exact same perspective or desired outcome. Even when we're talking about sort of immediate physical protection concerns. I do just want to very quickly highlight, I think this is a good opportunity to bring up Jamie Hagan's work. Jamie Hagan has done a lot of work on queering the women, peace, and security agenda in particular, but sort of more broadly like international relations. And Jamie just always, and this is something I really try to keep front of mind because I fall into this. Jamie highlights the importance of not just focusing on LGBT plus people as a group to be protected, but also as a group that is, and again, diversity within that group, but for the purposes of this discussion, we really should also be looking to these examples of queer groups who are already doing work for their own protection. We keep us safe. Like, there is so much good work already being done. And so that really needs to be taken into consideration at the same time, of course, that we are talking about these really urgent protection needs. So,
I'm just thinking here that at times, peacekeeping forces might not have the tools to address some of these complex issues, especially if they're military peacekeeping operations and the force is only in this country for a small period of time. What type of training does these peacekeepers have? Because at times peacekeeping forces can be part of the issue too. So let's segue to the next question. In their sectionality, one of my favorite questions. What role can intersectional analysis play in understanding the diverse experiences of LGBT plus persons in areas of armed conflict, and how can this inform the development of more targeted and effective protection strategies? We were talking about, since the LGBT is a diverse group, let's pinpoint it on intersectionality. Who wants to dive and first, I'm here.
I think intersectional analysis is really important. Also, it's my favorite topic too, because it's important to understand the interconnected nature of different forms of oppression, discrimination, and violence. And I think it gives us a valuable insight about the diverse experience of LGBTI people in conflict zone. I think through intersectional analysis, we can understand this the experience of LGBTI people. For example, there are some LGBTI people that who are also member of ethnic minorities or religious minorities. For example, in Afghanistan, there is right now, according to Amnesty International and other international organizations, that there is a ethnic cleansing against Hazara people in Afghanistan, or some organization call it a genocide against Hazara people. So LGBTI people, Hazara LGBTI people face multiple discriminations and violence, or there are Hazara LGBTI people that unfortunately, they even experience discrimination by the non-Hazara LGBTI people inside the country, unfortunately, or LGBTQ women inside of Afghanistan. They face multiple discrimination and violence. First, because of their gender identity as a woman, and the second thing because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation or gender expression. And through intersectional analysis help us to identify some specific protection needs, I think, because I think, for example, transgender people or lesbians experience different forms of violence than a cisgender gay man. For example, I can share you my experience about the situation of LGBTI people in Afghanistan. When Afghanistan fell down by the Taliban in 2021, we did our best to help some of the LGBTI people in Afghanistan that who are really vulnerable, to help them with the evacuation, and we tried to help them to come to Europe. But we understood that it was really difficult to evacuate lesbian and transgender women, and it was easier to relocate a cisgender gay man, because right now in most of the provinces in Afghanistan, the women cannot go outside of their house without a male family member or without the permission of a father or grandfather or their uncle. Or, for example, there were some LGBTI people, there were some transgender people who were stopped at the airport by the Taliban because of their different gender expression. So I think it's really intersectional analysis will help us to identify these specific protection needs, and then we can design a special program for that. And the other thing that I want to highlight is that when Afghanistan fell down, so we've seen that many international organizations try to help some of the most vulnerable people in Afghanistan for the evacuation. And there were some international organizations that tried to help the LGBTI people inside the country for the evacuation. But unfortunately, most of the LGBT, they sent some questionnaire in English or some forms in English to LGBTI people inside the country to fill out the forms. But unfortunately, they didn't consider the fact that there are many people in Afghanistan, they are illiterate, they cannot read and write, and even in their own language. So how did they expect them to speak with them in English? That's why we understood that most of the illiterate LGBTI people in Afghanistan left behind inside the country, unfortunately. And I think intersectional analysis will help us to do advocacy for inclusive protection strategies and advocating for policy change by highlighting the diverse experience of LGBTI people in conflict zone. Thank you.
Okay, who else would like to talk about this? Yes.
I can comment. Further, I think I will give Egypt an example. So the issue of so there are different groups who experience different levels of oppression. So we can see already the trans Egyptians and trans activists are both exposed to the homophobia of the transphobia of some of the gay organizations, local gay organizations. So they don't want to include them because it's like too much for them to handle. So we have trans organizations that split out of the gay movement, and they are more heavily targeted by the state because then they can treat them as sex workers. So usually if they arrest a trans activist or trans person, they fund money with them, they write sex work. And that's when then somebody comes from abroad, asks them, but we are not targeting them because they're trans, because they're sex work, and sex work is illegal. Because you might know that homosexuality is not explicitly illegal in the Egyptian legal code. We have something called the debauchery law. I think this is even worse because the debauchery then becomes this defined according, a friend of mine jokingly said it's like governance by vibe. The vibe of the officer today is to arrest two women holding hands, they will arrest. And this really puts us in a situation where you don't know whom they are targeting, okay, in a way. But looking at the intersections of all of this, It is have to do with sexual behavior, have to do with gender identity, and I think using more intersectional language, people can find common ways to address the problem. So you can say. Like Graham said, I talked about Queen Boat as a matter of torture instead of talking about gay issues. We can talk about general sex and gender discriminations that then include trans and gay issues, so that the bigger, because in a situation like in the military government in Egypt, almost everyone is targeted, but with different intensities. But it always helps if we also found common ways in which we share oppression. The second thing is there have been groups of gays. It's a small minority, but they're working closely with the Egyptian government. They begin to talk positively about the government. And then here, this reminds me of dealing.
Ahmed, you've frozen. Let's see.
When they support, whether do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good now, but we lost about the last 20 seconds.
Sure. So I was just saying that there are some gays, it's not a big, but there is a small entourage to CC that act exactly like the log cabin Republicans who supported Trump. And again, this is an intersection with the political leaning, and they fight internally also. They might say they are the ones saying we don't want these international organizations, these are Western organizations, we are living our lives. And it's good to just look at the situation in a complex way, and that's part of the education that happens when international organizations approach a complicated regions like this, just to know the wide variety of intersectional identities, of political leaning, of also poverty. Like there are cases, for example, there was a case called Hammam Bab al-Bahr in Egypt, where a TV presenter entered into a bus house and arrested 13 men. It created some international noise, but not as much, because these men belong to working class. They don't speak the language. When I talk to organizations, they say, "Oh, but they don't identify as gay." So, okay, but they are, but maybe they are not using the language. And thankfully now, Outright is providing Arabic language translation for the materials. So we are getting there. And really, I know it's a very complex topic, but I think by looking at, okay, how do I get into this universal rights, but address it in the culturally specific terms that is specific for the country or the region I'm working on.
Okay, Graham or Rachel, you want to chime in?
We're just gonna keep negotiating. So just two points I'll make on this. So I mean, I think any intersectionality is ultimately about power, right? Looking at power dynamics, and any institution, state or non-state, that stands to benefit from conflict, from violence, from marginalization, is going to then not benefit from international organizations bringing in an intersectional analysis, right? Like it's a huge threat. It's so important. And there are a couple of reasons for this, but so the two things I'd like to highlight. One, this idea of like controlling the body, right? Like so I mean, Ahmed is bringing up I'm so, well, not happy, that's not the word, but I'm grateful that you brought up this example from Egypt. This is something I've heard a bit about, but frankly, not as much as I think. It's not discussed as much as it should be in sort of international discussions around these topics. This way that through the criminalization of sex work, the Egyptian state manages to ultra criminalize queer people and trans bodies. I mean, this happens in the US as well, right? It happens globally. it's a huge issue. Reproductive rights, we're seeing this in the US, right? Like, I a lot of frustration about this from a lot of kind of second and third wave feminists in the US, which is where I'm from. But we saw a hyperfixation on only cis white women's rights. And there was not, in my opinion, enough attention to the, at first, quite fairly quiet attacks on LGBT plus people's rights in this country. And now it's full blown. And women have lost the right to abortion, like, which is in so many states. So the ways that these things are all connected, I mean, it cannot be lost. Like, if there's no gender affirming care for queer and trans people, there will not be reproductive rights for anybody, right? I mean, there's just no way around it. If queer families are not recognized and are not protected, then anybody, even like cis straight people who may want to sort of change it up a little bit from like the nuclear cis heteronormative family, are going to face issues. You're going to see, you're going to see divorce laws change. Sorry, I'm rambling a little. But the other thing that I want to point out on intersectionality at the international level is that there are, I'm not super pro incrementalism. I think in some cases, maybe there's a place for it, but this is not one of them. So like I said earlier, I work primarily sort of in the gender space, which means a lot of different things and can be a bit annoying. But that means on peace operations in particular, that I work a lot on women, peace, and security. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been in rooms with like decades long WPS advocates who have done incredible work for women's rights globally. And I have been told that we can't bring in queer rights and we can't bring in trans rights and we can't talk about sexual violence against men, for example, which links in, but also doesn't have to be about queerness. We can't talk about those things. I have literally been told that once we manage to make headway on women's rights, then we will start to look at these other things. I've been told that there are not enough resources. The resource fallacy is huge for this. There is not a lack of resources. Everything's just going to the military. Like, there is never, ever actually a lack of resources. And anyone who tells you that they do not have the money to expand even just responses to conflict-related sexual violence to also include men, they are lying to you. It's not true. They may not directly control those resources, but the money is there. And I just think it's so damaging that there's this hyper focus, even again among women who are an immensely, like, in many parts of the world, an immensely underprivileged group, an immensely vulnerable group. But we still see this sort of, this carving out of spaces, this exclusion within these marginalized groups. I mean, again, as Ahmed is saying, gay groups that don't want to include trans people, that don't want to fight for each other's rights. And I think that is, at our own sort of, at the grassroots level, at our own intercommunal levels, that is just as damaging as like the international community writ large not recognizing that queer people exist. For example, I'll stop there later. But
Okay, yes.
Thanks. I think I have three short points. The one is, I think that the intersectional analysis is indispensable in terms of understanding the commonality of the roots of violence, but at the same time recognizing the different experience of violence. And I think, to pick up on your point about sexual violence against men and boys, certainly our research in Syria showed that while all men and boys were vulnerable to sexual violence, is that for those people who are considered to be soft-looking, in other words, not achieving a kind of hegemonic masculinity, that the level of abuse was intensified, or the level of torture in detention was more severe, so that there's a different experience of that. I'm glad you picked up the point of resources, because that comes up so much in the sexual violence against men and boys arena. I think, to sort of channel Jamie Hagan and others, and probably inadequately, but just the the feminist scholars have argued for the necessity for challenging hegemonic masculinity as a peace building strategy within women, peace and security policy and practice, and thinking about how to dismantle the cultures of violent masculinity that sustain conflict, but that remain in place in a post-conflict period. And for example, kind of post-conflict nationalisms that reinforce hegemonic masculinity, where women and queer people remain structurally oppressed. So that peace building should address those structural inequalities and gender hierarchies. And there, again, an intersectional analysis is particularly helpful. And then I think to pick up on your point about power and the way in which it exposes power, and this is another something that Arnold brought out earlier, is the idea that, what political work does the mobilization of animosity towards queer people do in conflicts? And we see this in the anti-gender movement. You've alluded to a number of the manifestations of the interconnectedness of attacks on trans rights, attacks on reproductive rights. So I think just also naming that and analyzing what investments in power are can be revealed through the kinds of attacks on marginalized groups and others. And then also just recognizing the kind of distinctions between like the LGBT, the acronym, which often implies a kind of commonality of experience, but we know that that's not the case. I was thinking about some research that we did in Ghana, and not in a conflict situation, but the experience of violence by lesbians, against lesbians. So the animosity was directed because of being a lesbian, but the experience in the wake of that was was common to any women would experience that. And it's about economic marginalization in a setting in which women are often dependent on family structures, etc. And so a rejection from the family has a particular consequence for somebody as a woman, and in some senses being lesbian is incidental to that, aside from the original sort of animosity directed towards that. And then just thinking about, the specificity of, for example, in Ukraine, transgender women found it difficult to leave the country because of an absence of accurate documentation, because there wasn't a efficient legal gender recognition system in place, very cumbersome, in fact, very intrusive, very pathologizing legal gender recognition system in place. So, or an example of gay men in Chechnya in heterosexual marriages. So then how do you offer protection both for those individuals and for their families, and thinking beyond a kind of the sort of stereotypes of what gay men's lives look like, for example.
Wow, we've uncovered a lot. Let's take a 5-minute pause. You can eat some food, go to the bathroom, room, and get some sodas, and we'll come back at 1:10. And I do promise. Well, I added a question about the acronym of the LGBT, so we will get into that. Okay, so we'll look at our fourth question here, and this is a loaded question, I would say. So, given the challenges of monitoring and reporting incidents of violence and the discrimination against the LGBT and conflict situations, what innovative approaches can be employed to improve data collection and analysis, and how can this information be utilized to inform policy and practice? So we have, all of our panelists are part of international organization, so I'm pretty sure you'll have a lot to say on this.
Well, I think And I'm sure that you are agree that monitoring and reporting the incidence of violence and discrimination is very important. But on the other hand, it's very challenging in conflict zone, for example, Afghanistan, and partly it's maybe because of stigma or fears that LGBTI people have, and that prevents them from reporting the incidents. And on the other hand, I've seen a lot that there are many digital platforms that they encourage the LGBTI people to submit their the incidents anonymously through the digital platforms, violences and everything. But I think there is a problem with these digital platforms. We understood that right now in Afghanistan, most of the people, they don't have access to internet, and or many people, as I said before, there are some people that they are illiterate, so they cannot report these incidents or violences. Or in some provinces, in southern provinces of Afghanistan, there are many women that they don't have access to even a simple mobile phone, so that's why they cannot report these violences. So I think as I said before, it's really important to engage with the community-based organization or local LGBT-led organizations for data collecting, because they establish their relationship of trust with those LGBTI people on the ground inside the country. So and also we shouldn't forget that, and it's a fact that I understood that many LGBTI people may interview or may speak with the international organizations about the violences that they've seen or they've experienced, but the information, the data that they share with the international organization is far different from the information and data that they share with the local organizations or the local LGBT rights activists, because they can they have already trusted those local organizations or those activists. So that's why they are more comfortable to share more information in details and share with them properly. So that's why they engage these community-led based organizations or LGBT-led organizations, local LGBT-led organizations. They play a key role in data collection, I think. And I think it's really important that international organizations do participatory research with local organizations and foster collaboration with them. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in? Yeah.
I second, Artemis' point about engaging with the local community, but I will add concerning, in Egypt, we have a couple of IT security experts who are also activists and give training to people on encryption and digital security, because the state in many ways will try to do digital espionage onto these platforms or to try to break into this network. So it's very important to, while we are doing this data collection locally, it's very important to be mindful of our security, because the methods are getting more and more sophisticated day after day, and it's very important to keep up to date and to train people on these tools, and that's very important. And here, where international organizations can come in terms of collaborating on workshops for data security, training for activists and other about this type of securing the information flow about violence, about all these incidents that are happening.
Okay.
I can go next. So said in my last response that I don't like incrementalism, but this is actually maybe an example of where a bit of incremental openness could be important. So it can take a while for, like, if you're talking about data that is self-reported, particularly identity-based data, like, it can take a while for people to feel comfortable reporting. So I'm thinking, again, in my own work, even internal to UN peace operations, for example, we're talking about vulnerabilities and protection concerns in conflict-affected spaces, conflict-affected countries. these like peace operations, for example, also pose some of those security risks, right? Both for people external to the institutions, but also internal. There's a lot of sexual abuse and harassment. There's a lot of non-sexual harassment and abuse that takes place. And so even internal to these organizations, like collecting just demographic data to, again, fight back against the statements that these identities just aren't present, that they don't exist. This is another sort of uphill battle that I've seen in my own work, where the mere suggestion that maybe you should include a checkbox that is not just male or female, like maybe you should, not keep conflating biological sex and gender, allow people to self-report anonymously sexual orientation. It's very, very possible that the first time you do that with quantitative data, no one is going to report. No one is going to feel comfortable reporting in what they may perceive to be a very hostile environment to that particular identity. But the longer that checkbox, I mean, this is like the most basic level, right? The barrier to entry isn't actually that high, but the longer that checkbox exists on that survey that maybe people fill out every year, the more comfortable folks may feel actually self-reporting. And so that's super important. So literally just like incrementally beginning to introduce those sorts of self-reporting possibilities. The other thing, and again, maybe sticking to peace ops since it's the area I look at the most, for organizations doing response work to protection concerns, doing preventative protection work, representations, strategic communications is a huge thing right now for the UN. They love Stratcom, and it is very important. And not to put too much of a burden on representation, because representation alone, representation can be co-opted so easily. I feel like I probably don't have to explain that to this group, but even just like, so again, for example, if we're dealing with, like in a lot of interviews I do with UN peace ops and UN peacekeepers, the conflict-related sexual violence concern is women and girls, basically all the time. And even if you sort of run into somebody who is open to discussing that maybe sexual violence also happens against men and boys, maybe it also happens, maybe there's a single queer person in the entire country, things like that. They will still say, well, there's a huge barrier to reporting. Well, we don't know how to find those people. Well, we don't have the resources to address their concerns. And that may actually be true. But I think one way that international organizations really, in my opinion, have a responsibility to help attempt to lower that barrier to reporting is through representation. So the UN literally they put up billboards, it's really basic stuff. You can control the kinds of stories that you run, the press releases that you put out as the UN. You can control the content that goes out on UN public radio stations. And those avenues can highlight atypical experiences, right? They do not have to reinforce the frustrating stereotype that like this gender essentialist nonsense that both erases queer people and flattens like women and girls as this weird like homogenous group as being the only vulnerable group in conflict. So I definitely collecting data incrementally and recognizing that it may take a while to actually get accurate statistics, but then also ensuring that international orgs that hold a lot of power are really thinking hard about like not reinforcing the stereotypes that they purport to stand against.
I am very eager to really hear from you, since you work for the Human Rights Watch, about what your answer is.
Well, I think in many ways, a lot of the others have already mentioned some of the main points about trust, establishing trust, working with local groups where possible. I mentioned the example of Colombia Diversa, for instance, to ensure safety and confidentiality, to recognize that often these are very sensitive issues that have been discussed, that people, need a high level of security and privacy in terms of the kind of information that they impart. I mean, we work, of course, with individual stories that illustrate a bigger point as an advocacy strategy, as well as a documentation, an approach to documentation, because it's easier to understand and relate to and empathize with someone's experience rather than an abstract description of the kinds of violations that have taken place. Also, a kind of competence around terminology, a sensitivity to that. So that would require a lot of training in terms of the people who are doing the kind of data collection. On the question of terminology, I'm going to use an example of conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys. And that was that when in 2018, when the Women's Refugee Commission was doing work with men and boys, Rohingya men and boys, and were using the term sexual to describe the violence, so they were not getting a response, so they changed their approach and used the word torture, such as torture of the genitals, for example, during interviews, instead of using terms sexual or rape. And so as a result, interviews spoke about genital mutilation and other forms of sexual violence, but it was an example of reformulated methodology so that they were able to collect the evidence that they were not otherwise able to collect because they were unwittingly reproducing some of the stigmas associated with the sexual violence that was perpetrated in the first place.
Okay. I have one final question, then we can open it up to the floor here. So this one deals with, to what extent does the use of the LGBT acronym in the context of the international human rights discourse reflect a Western-centric perspectives, and how can the global community better recognize and accommodate diverse gender and sexual identities and conflict of afflicted regions. So we've been talking about the issue of the acronym. Sometimes it can be LGBTAP, it can go on and on and on. There are other more and inclusive terms that are out there. So let's unpack on this.
Okay, so I like the term LGBT plus because the plus really signify more. And for me, I even begin to stick more to the term after the emergence of in the UK and the US, what is called the LGBT alliances, which are highly transphobic gay and lesbian organizations. So this is why we should spell the T all the time. Because the LGBT Alliance, and for those familiar with the Gays Against Groomers and this highly transphobic organizations, which I'm seeing how it is resonating in the region in Egypt with some gays and with others. So I think I wasn't that tied to I thought we were beyond this, but I think we should repeat it's LGBT or you can say Q plus. But the plus for me really says, okay, and all others. But my worry is about the T, because we live in now a transnational, international, genocidal, transphobic environment where the US is a very highly visible country. The discourses emerging in the US affect a lot in the region is basically being adopted by conservative groups and laughably Islamist groups that are translating Fox News and others to promote a transphobic agenda. And here, I think it really plays a big role, the acronym, to use it. But then again, when you translate it then to Arabic and others, we can use the local language which exists. Some activists outright international have been working with some MENA activists to translate some of these terms. But it's very important to highlight the inclusivity of all these identities in light of the emergence of groups that want to annihilate the trans identity. So I think we live in a particularly disturbing times.
It kind of unveils that there's a hierarchy within the LGBT, and we forget that there is a T there. When we talk about transphobia becoming a global issue, that even within the LGBT part, they are sidelined. Anyone else?
Happy to take a second. So, I think it's a central tension, right? Because the purpose of having an acronym that is universally recognizable is also so that it can be making universal claims that these identities are so different around the world. And so, which terms are used? Why is it LGBT? What are the histories behind those terms? But also, what concepts of the self and the sexuality, and even just the idea that sexuality is a kind of essence of the self, is a relatively recent idea, right? So it is immensely complicated in terms of transnational advocacy. So I see it as a kind of necessary shorthand in order to render intelligible what is an immensely complex terrain. But what happens then when certain identities are kind of privileged over others? And we were having a conversation actually over lunch, also in terms of the kinds of class dimensions that sometimes come up in transnational advocacy in particular. Who are the groups who have access to transnational networks and resources? And also, what impact potentially does it have on people's own subjectivity when, in a sense, you're required to present yourself in a certain way in order to be readable, in order to be intelligible, and in order to access those kind of transnational networks and resources? So these are never neutral terms, and they have an effect in the world. We're the LGBT program. We haven't included Q because it's seen as kind of legally sort of iffy in terms of it's an umbrella term that includes everything. But I certainly register the limitations of having LGBT and sort of see it as a kind of symbolic placeholder rather than a deep investment in that particular sort of formation of acronym or identity.
Anyone else would like to chime in on this?
I can speak just very quickly. I agree with Graham that I think, at a certain point, a term is a placeholder. Maybe from a very practical perspective in my own work, when I'm writing, I write a lot of policy reports. That's most of my job. It's very exciting. But if I am writing on LGBTQ plus issues, first of all, the inclusion of the Q is often kind of the most not even controversial necessarily in my own spaces, but that's sort of the thing that gets flagged immediately as having really disparate meanings. I mean, there are, they wouldn't want me to call them queer, there are gay Americans who still see queer as a slur. It's often there's a big generational sort of argument about that. Which then is interesting when you're right, that is the term that I use to describe myself. And so it becomes, that all of these things sort of get quite mixed up. They can get quite mixed up interpersonally as well. But so definitely, again, practically LGBT plus, and always including the plus, as Ahmed is saying, and always including the T, I think can sort of, that can be very well encompassing. The only other thing that I'll say is where I usually end up in my writing is actually just sexual and gender minorities, which again, it's still not a perfect term, but it does tend to encompass, it can be argued that it encompasses everything. And I have gotten feedback again, I mean, super contentious, very complex landscape. No one, you know, you're never going to please absolutely everyone, but I do find that sexual and gender minorities tends to, it doesn't receive the critique that LGBT plus can receive of being sort of Western centric. It is, you know, it's a bit, I don't personally actually think it's any more encompassing, but you know, these things become very symbolic. So
Okay, did anyone else want to chime in? Okay, we still have some more time. We have some questions, I think, in the chat, and if our audience has any questions. So I guess we can start with the audience questions in the in chat.
Excellent. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm going to take a little bit of liberty as the helping organizer person by asking my own question. And then we can get to all of your questions, which are, I'm sure, equally amazing. Graham and Ahmed both mentioned persons whose identities and experiences might not align with the Western perception of gender and sexuality that we tend to push internationally. In Bolivia, for instance, my first published paper was on an anti-colonialist rejection of the idea of gay identity and queer identity in indigenous areas. I committed pretty much a year of my life to field work in that area. People chose to identify through indigenous Aymaran or Quechuan terms, and despite simultaneously experiencing gender and sexuality-based discrimination and violence, they rejected Western notions of LGBT identities and rights, specifically marriage rights, because this was 2016, as infringements and erasure of their indigenous cultures. They're not wrong for feeling this way, in my opinion. Less than 200 years ago, these same countries who are now asking them to include pro-LGBT policies were committing genocide against their own people, specifically against people for whom did not fit that very Western narrative at the time, a Catholic narrative in Bolivia specifically that ensured that relations were only between men and women. In regards to persons who don't consider themselves LGBT for these reasons, but are still unjustly persecuted or face violence for being perceived as belonging to these groups, is there space for both reformulating these terms, localizing, and then also maintaining specific protections on the highest levels for LGBT identified persons? Is there a way that we can offer the same protections to these persons without them having to identify or say, you know, check the box, so to speak, in these American and in Western terms?
Wow, that was a really good.
Sorry, it's very long.
I think it's such an excellent question, and it's a very challenging question because, I would just kind of repeat a little bit of what I said earlier, is about, you know, producing a kind of language or terminology that is kind of can be applicable, but who's included and who's excluded. I would, you know, imagine there your sexual and gender minorities language might be more apt. I mean, it does echo my own research in a South African context, in which I was looking at more smaller, a small town and rural gay life in the post-apartheid period, and shift in terms of subjectivity because of an intersection of local, national, and transnational ideas. And there was a series of workshops run on how to be a real gay, which was really about how to be like a sort of modern gay, if you like. So that people who had been recognized as different and were very flamboyant in their self-presentation and had a kind of social niche that they occupied, usually as hairstylists or as healers, and saw no need to kind of come out and because it was sort of self-evident to them. And they certainly saw themselves as like the real gays, not the workshopped gays who were made because they don't even know how to dress, they don't know how to perform, they don't know how to. So I just use that as an example because I was interested there in how there's an intersection between kind of very local ideas about gender and sexuality and presentation of the self, a kind of national conversation that was going on in South Africa at the time because of constitutional protection based on sexual orientation, and then this transnational dynamic and how that affected people's subjectivity, the way they presented themselves, and the material consequences of the ways in which they presented themselves. And also that there was a new incentive because of the political change in South Africa to be kind of coming out and representing themselves in a more way that was more aligned to the kind of national conversation. So that's not really an answer to your question. It's more just a way of agreeing with the complexity that you bring to this discussion. And I don't know how to address it because people are left out and excluded, and some people are privileged. And those people, generally speaking, occupy a kind of position in the social hierarchy that is, often a more kind of middle class position, not exclusively, but often that is the case.
So I will complement the answer. Yeah, we did this completely. We face the same across the Middle East. The same question is like, how comes these countries that colonize some of this area will tell us on a personal level, I believe in universal human rights. I think that's the flip side of you can say European colonialism, but in the French Revolution is what gave us the universal human rights we live by today. So there is type of progress that's happening, but how to bring this without being labeled as colonial, as racist, as etc. I think this is up for like people like myself and others who are might be more Western educated, but then also are familiar with the local culture. Is really this premise of people dignity should be preserved, like really coming at the very basics of not really discussing even the specific of what to be gay, what to be lesbian, and really the preservation of dignity across the board. Because once you say West and East, then you give it up to the local conservatives and local dictatorships to really say, okay, this is Western, we can imprison people, and then we be called, this is our own culture. And this was it was said when the ISIS throwing of gays were there. I remember presenting this video in a panel in New York City. I was myself accused of Islamophobia and so on. I really rejected, of course, this accusation because I think we cannot really hide ourselves, say, oh, it is not happening. No, it's happening. Yeah, the emergence of ISIS is very complicated. There is a vacuum of power, the invasion of Iraq, and all of these things. But at the end, they have a religious code that doesn't preserve the dignity of these people, and this have to be talked about. So we can really then choose the angle of this universal dignity, the dignity of a human, and define what a human is. Because this is where it goes down to. What happened, I live in Germany. What happened in Germany before in World War II is really you begin to dehumanize certain minorities. You say Jews are not humans, gays are not human, and this is what's happening. The persecution is really up, because, okay, you can begin to discriminate against people, put them in jail, but the next step is genocide. There is no big step between both. So really focusing on this, because I really reject the idea of keeping going with the smaller relativism to the end, because it will end us up in disasters of communities being annihilated, and we are just standing by because we feel guilty about interfering. So I feel strongly about this, and I think it's important to really be daring and push things forward.
Can I add one thing to that? Sorry, and I'll be short because I did want to address the question of who can speak on these issues, because I would absolutely agree with what Arnold was saying there. And it's more around strategy, because say, for example, many of the laws of colonial origin that we know and understand, but those laws were justified in terms of a perception of the kind of sexual licentiousness of the colonized people. So in that sense, same-sex relations were bundled with other forms of sexual activity as seen as a kind of marker of the primitive, if you like. And now fast forward, and now kind of tolerance of same-sex relationships is seen as a kind of marker of modernity, if you like. And so countries are then pressured to be, so I kind of get it politically why they would be like, well, who are you to tell us what to do? And that does shape strategy, who's best placed to speak or to engage on these issues.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the session. It's been really informal and
amazing so far to learn about all the issues that we're having these days for the LGBTQ community. But my question, I wrote it down so I don't forget any part of it. So there are two school of thoughts, in my opinion, to advocate for the LGBTQ plus community in a region with cultural and religious barriers. The first is to vocally advocate, as I said, with daring energy from distance, as a diaspora or your person living abroad. And the second is to utilize the soft power opportunities to normalize the LGBTQ community in the hostile society. So soft power examples that I used in the past in my region, they came in the act of just like normalizing, providing, creating a safe environment for the community without saying it out loud. So we don't say anything out loud to avoid certain aggressions and certain targeting, and to minimize that toward the community, the LGBTQ community. So in your opinion, is the second approach, by utilizing soft power, not saying it out loud, is wishful thinking and relying on the next generation to dismantle slowly the hostile environment without creating aggression? Or is it, certain people say that we're escaping real confrontation with governments and lawmakers? Or is it a good forward-looking approach that is safe but will take a little bit of time?
Okay, I will answer one part. The soft, I don't know whether it's soft power or not, but as someone living abroad, what I personally can do is really try to lobby against the government by, especially in the US, to almost shut down the military aid flowing from the US to Egypt. Not everyone will do this because it can cause problems for your family or other things, but then also can cause backlash. But we consult with the local. I think sometimes the situation is so desperate that the local communities are like, okay, go for it, go for the more intense measures. And I think in my opinion, this works on some levels. But at the end of the day, it is the confrontation that the local community will do with the state. Because what happened in the US, what made things change is that people came out in masses. There was a very violent confrontation.
One major point that I want to highlight: your confrontation might raise the opportunity for not the government or the lawmaker to raise the aggression and targeting for the LGBTQ, but actually the society itself. I believe that certain people who are using very daring approaches could harm from a local perspective. And I'm talking about someone who worked in the field, like within a very hostile community, utilizing soft power. So because I didn't want to be targeted, but most importantly, the people that I'm trying to protect to be targeted.
No, I agree with you. I think both work. I have done the confrontational one, and I have been receiving death threats almost daily, but that's my style. I don't like the but like I like the fight. I don't want I like to be out there and really entering into the fight. But of course, the other approach of people working on the community, trying slowly to addressing both work, and whenever there is an intense event that will happen, we definitely consult with local NGOs, whether you think these measures can be done or not. Because at the end of the day, you can deceive yourself by saying that will change without a confrontation. I think here I will be careful that they might eat you up at some point. So I think it's a very tricky terrain. And in Egypt, for example, I have seen change happening over the years. I was pretty young when the Queen Boat happened. There was no really discussion about homosexuality, but I feel that when Sarah Ghazi, specifically my dear friend Sarah Ghazi, committed suicide in Canada, she paid the ultimate price. There was a discussion. There was people who liked her, who defended the whole thing, and there was a whole societal discussion. From time to time, you need shocking events. You need shocks, because a society is not going to change without shock from time to time to happen. And I think history will tell what will happen.
If I can add something with your impression with soft power, depending on what country we're in or what area we're in, I think pop and culture can be a powerful tool and an extremely powerful tool. If LGBT plus issues are being talked about on TV or on film or on song, that can spread, some of this where the goodness. I try not to talk that over pretty much. I'm here since I'm just the moderator. I can talk for a long time about culture. So I guess we should get to some more questions.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. I'm coming from the School of Public Health, and in March there was a panel of LGBTQ plus human rights activists, and there was one from Ethiopia and one from DRC who wasn't able to come. But both of them weren't able to use their full real names or mention the organizations that they worked at due to the risk of persecution. And so I guess I'm wondering, how do you, in that type of environment, how do you support the local organizations that know how to keep themselves safe, that are doing that hard work, that's slow, incremental, and that is like sometimes the only thing to do? How can international organizations and NGOs from the outside support them without being at risk? Like, what does that look like? I don't have a successful example to look to. Well,
I think Artemis is the expert on
that. Can you write the question in the chat box? Because I was writing in the chat box to write a question because I couldn't hear properly, unfortunately.
I can try and repeat if it's okay, and let me know if I'm incorrect. Artemis, I think the idea is, how can international organizations support local organizations such as yourself without making you a target, or organizations like yours a target for non-state armed groups or other actors who might seek to cause you harm? Is there a balance between supporting local efforts and even displaced efforts in this area without making this situation even more unsafe or putting a target on you?
Well, I think it's a really hard question. I think because unfortunately, our organizations were targeted by the Taliban many times. Me personally, I was targeted by the Taliban thousands of times. I received death messages, threat messages, unfortunately, not only by the Taliban, but also by the society. I was targeted, or even, unfortunately, by some Afghan human rights defenders. Unfortunately, they ignored the existence of LGBTI people, unfortunately. For example, I had an interview with Radio Liberty in Prague, and the Zabihullah Mujahid, the spokesperson of the Taliban, attended online in that interview. And he said that after my speech, he said that we don't have gay people inside of Afghanistan, and we don't have any gay people, and these people were brought to Afghanistan by NATO and Western countries. So I think international community, just because the Taliban right now in Afghanistan, they deny our existence on the one hand, on the other hand, they are suppressing us, they oppress us on the ground. But I think international community can echo our voices, because we are already targeted. I think we cannot do anything with that. But we are outside of the country, so they cannot do anything. They cannot do anything special to harm us. But for example, except online attacking or something. But I think international community, the only thing that they can do is that to echo our voice, amplify our voices. Because I have no idea for this question, because I'm already under the attack by the Taliban. I'm already targeted by the Taliban, but unfortunately, I have no idea how international community can support me and in this situation.
I will second Artemis here. The international organizations need to just expand our voices, because the targeting is already there. I think it's in terms of doing something abroad, people get harassed by agents of the Egyptian foreign like mission repeatedly. They cannot do anything, but if you are a Saudi activist, then you have to be more careful, because then they can do something transnationally. So the very important thing is for international organizations to amplify the voices. And what protected many human rights activists in Egypt, like in the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, is the extreme visibility. They arrested one activist, Hossein Bahagat, and everyone knew around the world there were people were saying release him, because now, thankfully, there is $300 million who are withheld from Egypt in terms of military aid, thanks to activists that I have been involved with. So they don't want anymore the international headache. So the very high visibility also is important into, okay, let's avoid this headache, because this person is too visible. Once they do something, then phone calls come from other foreign governments and organizations that basically they don't want this, especially that economically now they cannot afford steps like this.
Also, I want to highlight another point, that international community should make it costly for the non-state actors or the state. That, for example, Taliban in Afghanistan should feel this fear that if we attack the LGBTI people, there will be some consequences. The international community will impose some sanction because of the human rights abuses, LGBT rights abuses. So I think international community should make it costly for the state or non-state actors for the human rights abuses of LGBTI people. For example, for the case of Afghanistan, international community have done nothing for the LGBTI people on the ground, unfortunately. For example, UN Security Council had many formal meetings about the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, about the women, ethnic minorities. What about LGBTI people? Have they ever, for example, recently I was at the UN Security Council and I spoke about the situation of LGBTI people in Afghanistan, but it wasn't a formal meeting. It was informal meeting, unfortunately, because I think international community, as I said before, they don't have a strong willingness to support the LGBTI people on the ground or make it costly for the non-state actors about their activities against LGBTI people.
And just, very practically, just in terms of doing research, is that always a priority would be security and thinking about where to include people, how to go about doing that from a human rights watch perspective. And then just to pick up on, it's obviously significant that the people you mentioned that were, if I understand correctly, we're working with under the umbrella of the HIV/AIDS organizations. Or
I don't think so.
oh, okay.
I don't think they were. I think some of them were arts, some were doing communications, but mostly human rights.
Okay. I was mentioning that because sometimes that sort of health gives an umbrella in which to do other kinds of work, and that has been relatively successful in some settings. And then just on the question of kind of sanctions is often kind of complicated, right? Because say, for example, in Uganda, activists there have mostly requested for there not to be sanctions because of the risk of an added stigma on an already unpopular community. Is that if there is, it's a perception that aid is being withheld, which affects many people, that they would then be in an even more vulnerable situation.
We can take one more question. Is anybody think there was something? Okay. Let me check just to make sure that the chat itself does not brought any new questions to the floor. Otherwise, I'll give it to Cam to close us out. No, I think we're good.
Okay, wow. So, we could have talked for 4 hours, even 5 hours. There's a lot to unpack here. And this is just a starting, point, So these issues mean a lot to you all. Can continue to talk about them, to engage them. These issues are not going away anytime soon. So thank you to our panel, to our online panel, or
Thank you very much.
and person panel, to our audience, to the food that we had. Hopefully everyone has a good Friday. Good luck on your finals if you have those, and that's about it.
Thank you so much, everybody.